Ever feel like you completely tripped at the starting line? Like you had all the potential in the world, all the advantages, and then face planted.
Oof. Yeah, I think we've all been there.
Yeah, well, today's deep dive is about someone who knew that feeling well, John Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we're exploring this with insights from a sermon by Pastor Clay Gibbons, and
Oh, wait.
he uses this incredible analogy of like an Olympic steeplechase runner to describe John Mark's journey.
Okay.
And it really struck me because, even the most prepared, the most talented, they can stumble.
It's true. It's that whole idea of, like, everyone falls, right? Most of us, we don't get the gold medal. But it's what happens after the fall that really matters.
Exactly. And what makes John Mark's story so interesting is that he goes from this honestly pretty dramatic fall from grace to becoming a major figure in early Christianity.
It's a remarkable transformation for sure. So where do we even begin with him?
Well, let's rewind to the beginning. Pastor Gibbons paints this picture of John Mark's early life as incredibly privileged, like almost a who's who of early Christianity.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What do you mean?
Okay, so we're talking about his mother, Mary of Jerusalem. She was this prominent figure in the early church.
Okay.
And in the book of Acts, we see her home was basically like a central meeting place for Jesus's followers.
Wow. So John Mark grows up surrounded by these early believers.
Yeah. And some scholars even think the Last Supper might have happened there. Imagine like young John Mark witnessing those early gatherings, maybe even meeting Jesus himself.
Wow. Talk about an immersive experience of early Christianity.
Right. And it's not just like a passing encounter. Pastor Gibbons talks about how John Mark had this close relationship with the Apostle Peter.
Really? Like a mentor-mentee kind of thing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some scholars even suggest Peter was almost like a spiritual father to John Mark.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this young man, John Mark, surrounded by these giants of the faith.
Yeah, and it gets even more intense. Remember how Paul and Barnabas went on that first missionary journey?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, John Mark goes with them.
No way.
Yeah.
So he's not just learning about the faith in a comfortable setting. He's out there on the front lines spreading the gospel.
Exactly. And we're not talking about a casual trip here. They faced opposition, witnessed incredible events. This was a crash course in early Christianity.
It's hard to believe that someone with that kind of background, with those mentors, could ever, mess up.
I know, right? But that's what's so fascinating about John Mark. It's like Pastor Gibbons says, even with this incredible start, there's this dramatic turn in his story.
Oh, what happens?
Well, in the middle of this super important mission, John Mark just leaves. He leaves Paul and Barnabas.
He just leaves, see you later, guys, kind of leaves.
No, it's way more than that. Pastor Gibbons points out that the original Greek word used in the text implies a much more serious situation. It's not a casual goodbye, it's more like a desertion.
Oh, wow. So this isn't just about John Mark changing his travel plans. This was a decision with serious consequences.
Exactly, and it really affected Paul, who was already facing a lot of opposition in his ministry.
Yeah, I can imagine.
He was so angry and hurt by John Mark's actions that he flat out refused to work with him again.
Wow.
It even caused this whole rift between Paul and Barnabas.
Really?
Yeah, because Barnabas, Mr. Son of Encouragement, he still believed in John Mark. He wanted to give him another chance.
So you have Paul feeling betrayed.
Yeah.
And Barnabas advocating for grace and a second chance.
Exactly. It really highlights the complexity of these early relationships, even within the church. It's easy to imagine, John Mark just fading into obscurity after such a public, kind of failure.
Right, that's the end of his story.
Exactly. But Pastor Gibbons points out that this is actually where things take, honestly, kind of a surprising turn.
Okay, I'm listening.
So fast forward maybe a decade or so later, Paul is now a prisoner in Rome, facing, possible execution. And it's in this context, in his letters to the Colossians and to Timothy, that he mentions John Mark.
He does, after all that.
He does, and it's not just a casual, oh yeah, remember that guy. Paul specifically asks for John Mark to come to him. He calls him helpful, a comfort.
Wow, that's surprising.
Right. I mean, this is the same Paul who was so deeply hurt by John Mark's actions years earlier.
Yeah, and now he's finding solace in John Mark's presence as he's facing his own mortality.
Exactly. It really makes you wonder what happened during those years in between,
Right. What changed? Did John Mark join up with Barnabas? Did they continue doing ministry together?
That's what I was thinking. Did John Mark dedicate himself to, growing in his faith, understanding his own strengths, his weaknesses?
Right, because clearly something shifted for Paul to have such a change of heart.
Exactly. Sadly, the text doesn't give us all the details.
Oh, bummer.
I know. But what we do know is that John Mark, he's not that impulsive young man who abandoned the mission field anymore. He'd obviously gone through some major transformation.
Yeah, even Paul recognized it.
It's a pretty powerful reminder that our mistakes, even our public failures, they don't have to define
So
us.
there's always room for growth, for second chances.
Absolutely. And that's definitely the case with John Mark, because Pastor Gibbons then takes us to First Peter.
Okay.
And here's Peter, who's also in Rome, and he refers to John Mark as, wait for it, my son.
My son.
Yeah.
You mean like acknowledging that close relationships they had?
Yeah,
After all that.
I know. It's
Yeah.
amazing. And remember, this is Peter we're talking about, the disciple who denied even knowing Jesus.
Mm. Oh, man. Yeah, talk about second chances.
Exactly. And for Peter to publicly acknowledge John Mark as my son, it speaks volumes, especially in that cultural context.
So not only has John Mark been restored in Paul's eyes, but also in Peter's.
Exactly. And this is where John Mark's story intersects with, like, the very foundation of our faith.
Okay, how so?
Well, tradition says that while John Mark was in Rome with Peter, he started writing down Peter's firsthand accounts of Jesus.
You mean like his eyewitness testimony?
Exactly. And those writings, according to tradition, became the basis for the Gospel of Mark.
Whoa. Hold on. So are you saying that the Gospel of Mark is basically Peter's story told through John Mark?
That's what tradition holds.
Wow. That changes how I think about the Gospel of Mark.
Right. It adds this whole other layer. It's like we're not just reading Mark's account, we're potentially getting Peter's perspective on Jesus's life, teachings, everything.
Okay, yeah, that's huge. That makes me want to go back and reread Mark with fresh eyes. It's like we're trying to, I don't know, decode a secret message, right?
Right, like those Russian nesting dolls, you
Yeah.
open one and there's another one inside.
Exactly. We have the Gospel of Mark on the surface, but then, like, maybe this whole other layer of Peter's experiences shaping the whole thing.
And the cool thing is, there are totally these clues within Mark that suggest this, like the Peterian perspective.
Okay, yeah, like what?
Well, think about it. One of the things that makes Mark's gospel stand out is that fast-paced, action-packed style.
Right, like bam, 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 it doesn't let up. Exactly. It's like you're right there in the middle of the action. And when you think about Peter as a disciple, that totally tracks.
Totally. Peter was always like the first one to speak up, the first to act.
Sometimes impulsively, right?
Exactly.
So when you encounter that same energy, that same kind of rush of events in Mark, it makes you wonder,
If it's not just Peter's personality, like seeping into how the story is being told.
Exactly.
And it's more than just the pacing, too, right?
Right.
There are specific stories, moments, details that Mark includes that really seem to point to Peter's experiences, his relationship with Jesus, even like his own failings.
Oh, absolutely. Like that whole thing with Peter denying Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
That's in all four Gospels, but there's this rawness, this immediacy in Mark's version that just hits different.
It's like you're right there in the courtyard with them.
Exactly.
Okay, but now I have to know. Do we have any idea, like, what their process was like? I mean, here's John Mark writing Peter's account. Did they ever, like, debate which stories to include, which details to focus on?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
I know, we just don't know for sure.
But we can imagine, right, we can imagine these conversations they might have had, the memories they revisited, the emotions they grappled with as they were piecing together the narrative of Jesus's life.
Wow. It's easy to forget sometimes that these texts, these like foundational parts of our faith, they came from real lived experiences, real relationships.
Right, they weren't just like beamed down from heaven fully formed.
Exactly. Like they were carefully crafted, shaped by human hands and hearts.
And I think that makes them even more powerful, more relatable, because it reminds us that the people who witnessed all of this, who dedicated their lives to sharing Jesus's message, they were human.
They doubted, they made mistakes, and yet God still used them in extraordinary ways.
And that's the beauty of grace, isn't it?
I think that's what makes John Mark's story so powerful. He goes from this privileged young man to someone who makes a really big mistake, and then to finding redemption, playing this crucial role in preserving the story of Jesus.
It's a good reminder that our stories are never truly over, no matter how many wrong turns we take. There's always potential for a new chapter, for forgiveness, for finding our place in God's story.
So the next time you open the Gospel of Mark, remember John Mark, remember his journey, try to hear Peter's voice in those words, feel his passion, his humanity.
And remember that just like John Mark, God can work through your story too, even with all of your imperfections.
Absolutely. That's it for our deep dive on John Mark.